We are about to step into the second day of the Holy Week. Now, you might say, wait, isn't that a few weeks away? Yeah, but we're going to work through it very slowly over the next several weeks. We're looking at the Passion Week, or the Holy Week of Jesus' time right before his crucifixion. And as we mentioned last week, that 1 week takes up about 40% of the gospel material in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's a lot to talk about. And the theme that we're going to work through as we go through the next several weeks is one look at the temple. In fact, two temples. And so we've called it A Tale of Two Temples. Last week we kind of did a quick survey of the history of the temple from its founding with Moses and the tabernacle all the way up until Herod's large renovation project that we see in the first century, or around the first century, when Jesus would have walked into it. And last week we left off as Jesus is riding into the city on a donkey. 1,400 years of history has been baked into this one building. It was a tent at one point, so about 1,000 years of this site. The temple, if you remember, was something that God designed and instructed his people to build according to a specific design. And it was a very special place in all of the earth. The only place on earth that you could come into the presence of God in a special way. A place you could draw near to God in a way that wasn't possible anywhere else. But the temple was also a big object lesson for anyone willing and wanting to come near to God. Approaching God was sacred. You didn't simply walk up to the Ark of the Covenant and pray. There was a number of requirements leading up into that Holy of Holies. And purity was a big deal. You couldn't come into the temple if you were not qualified. Even the outer parts of it, you couldn't enter. Purity, as God defined it, came in many different ways through the law given to Moses in Israel. And this flows out of God's nature as pure himself. While under the Old Covenant, Israel was obligated to observe a number of purity laws. But all of these reflected God himself. Because God was unique among the other various gods of the Israelites' time, in that he was completely, internally consistent with his character. You see, the gods of the Canaanites, they were capricious and vicious. No one expected them to stay ethically consistent, to stay true to their word. Their gods were much more like us, change our decisions based on our mood or how we feel about something or someone. Israel's God, however, he was someone who could be trusted to keep his word and to be holy and pure in his own character. And out of this came the expectations for Israel's leadership as well. No one, not even the priests or even the kings, were above God's law. A fairly revolutionary idea. The law of God was his sovereign will for the nation of Israel. And God's moral consistency, it's a blessing that you and I probably take for granted. Sometimes we cringe because we think he's too strict, maybe. But if we take a minute and pause and really consider how much of a praiseworthy blessing it is that God is perfect and in his character and doesn't shift and change, it draws you into worship. But all of these things are communicated also in the tabernacle or the temple. Because as people sought to approach the Lord, they did so on his terms and within his framework of the ceremonies that God prescribed. aimed at illustrating the moral implications of a sinner approaching a sinless God, and of God providing a way for people who are morally corrupt to be clean in his sight. You catch a glimpse of this in the book of Psalms, chapter 24. Listen to what the author says. Who shall ascend? I think there's a slide for it. My clicker is not working. Thank you. Who shall ascend to the hill of the Lord? This is Jerusalem. It sits on top of a hill. And one of the highest peaks in Jerusalem is where the temple sits. You're ascending to the temple, the place where you connect with God. Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord? And who shall stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not lift up his soul to what is false, and does not swear deceitfully. Under the old covenant, there were other things, many other things, that could also prevent you from being able to draw near, to come closer into the temple, further into the presence of God. Things that could make you unclean would be things like certain foods or diseases, especially leprosy, different bodily discharges, or contact with dead bodies. That was a really big one. And idolatry, also very big. The law showed you that you definitely needed help in being pure enough to worship and draw near to God. And the law showed you that God wanted to help you, but that there were certain things that were not permitted to come close to God. But in addition to worshipers being cleansed, the tabernacle or the temple needed cleansing as well. Here's an example of a command concerning cleansing of the temple in Leviticus, chapter 16, verse 32. It reads this: And the priest who is anointed, thank you. The priest who is anointed and consecrated as priest in his father's place shall make atonement, wearing the holy linen garments. He shall make atonement for the holy sanctuary, and he shall make atonement for the tent of meeting, and for the altar, and he shall make atonement for the priests and for all the people of the assembly. You see, the business of the temple meant that it needed purified from time to time as well. And when Jesus comes into the temple this Monday morning, boy, it's in desperate need of a cleaning. We've come to Herod's temple. And a temple that has recently been renovated. And it's never been better from at least a worldly perspective. The temple has never been as grand, as big, as lush. Business was booming. You never had a bigger temple. Temple Mound, the building was as big as it had ever been. Political stability had not really been this good for quite a while either, coming out of some very uncertain times through the intertestamental period with the Maccabees and political upheaval and rebellions. There was even an intentional assault upon the Jews and their religion during that time that involved the temple, and that was passed. But now under Rome, there was a reasonable amount of peace that the temple had, and it hadn't had for a while. There were still problems, of course. There's always problems. Those problems were much more stable. Religious ceremonies were reasonably well kept. Idolatry was all but eradicated during the Second Temple Judaism. Problems that they had under the First Temple were largely dealt with as far as idolatry goes. Purification ceremonies working on schedule like clockwork. A lot of the law is being kept. So what really needs cleansing here? Let's see what our text says. We're in Monday, remember, of Passion Week. The day before, Sunday evening, Jesus rode in on a donkey. And he came into the temple the night before and he looked around. And in Mark 11:11, yep, one more forward. There we go. We see this. He entered Jerusalem. He went into the temple. He had a look around at everything. As it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So Jesus goes up and he looks around and then he just heads home. Kind of anticlimactic, wouldn't you say? But you notice what's coming tomorrow isn't a knee-jerk reaction. What he's about to do the next day, he's had a whole night to think about and pray about. And then he heads back into Jerusalem. But on his way, he passes this fig tree. It has some leaves. So he goes up to it because he's hungry, but it has no fruit. So Jesus curses it. And he says this in Mark 11:14. May no one ever eat fruit from you again. And his disciples heard it. And they kind of keep going. Well, that's kind of a strange snippet. This is another illustration of what he's about to find in the temple. Jesus continues to Jerusalem. And they came to Jerusalem. And he entered the temple and he began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them, saying to them, is it not written, my house shall be a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers? And the chief priests and the scribes, they heard it and were seeking a way to destroy him. For they feared him, because all the crowds were astonished at his teaching. And when evening came, they went out of the city. The temple cleansing is one of the most significant actions in Jesus' public ministry. During this very public and very dramatic scene and event, Jesus set some things into motion that was kind of a one-way street. It was at this point that the religious leaders decided, okay, it's time for Jesus to go. The leaders as a group were still somewhat divided or unsure about how to deal with Jesus. Can they massage the situation, or what are they going to do? It was at this point, though, after he comes in and drives everyone out, they're sure what they need to do. Jesus has got to go. This is also significant in that it's the only time that we have that Jesus really gets upset like this. If you're looking for a place to find when Jesus got angry, this is going to be the place to look. And it appears that Jesus is upset at turning a house of prayer into a den of thieves. You see, one of the things that the leaders had figured out was the same thing that Kings Island, Disneyland, Cedar Point, all these big places have figured out. Do you remember the last time you went to a theme park? You're probably walking around. You get there somewhat in the morning. You get around lunchtime and you're kind of getting hungry. You decide it's time to eat. So you look at your map and you see where the different options are. And you find the one you like. And so you make your way through the crowds and you get turned around a couple times and get lost and have to look at your map again and figure out which way to wind through the buildings. But you finally get there and you see the menu and you look at the prices and you think, those are pretty reasonable. I don't think that's ever been my reaction. The food inside the park is usually 2 to 5 times more expensive than just outside the park. They're playing on something called captive audience pricing. That's when you have very limited options to buy something, so sellers can mark up their prices much higher, knowing that you don't really have other options, and this is what you're going to probably buy. So, business practice would be called price gouging, or maybe a more polite term, convenience pricing for your convenience. I'm not exactly thrilled buying a $5 hamburger for $15, let alone 5 of them for my family. That adds up really fast. You know how many mac and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches you can make for the same amount of money? Now, what if it wasn't hamburgers? What if it was your ability to obey and worship God's will? What if these business practices were now using the exclusive nature of the temple? It appears that this is one of, if not the biggest reason Jesus got so upset. You see, God's people were instructed to make pilgrimages to Israel, at least 3 a year. For Passover, which was in spring, the Feast of Weeks, which was a little bit later, about a little bit late spring, and then the Feast of Tabernacles, which was fall. So 2 in spring, 1 in fall. The Jews living close to Jerusalem, it wasn't too hard to make these trips, but if you lived further away, it could be more difficult. Then, if you didn't have means to travel that often, and you kind of had to pick one, Passover was typically the one that people would pick, and if they had to give up some others, they would give up the other ones. Passover was the big one. Each family was required to come to the temple and offer a lamb, a paschal lamb. And it just couldn't be any lamb, though. You couldn't just pull one out of your herd and take it in. It had some kind of stringent requirements. It had to be a male, 1 year old, couldn't have any blemish or no defect, no problems with it. Couldn't be sick, couldn't have an injury, um, couldn't be spotted, no lumps. It had to be selected on the 10th of Nisan, and then you kept it with your family for 4 days. And then on that 4th day, the 14th of Nisan, it was sacrificed at the temple. And this was part of the legal requirements that God gave to Israel. You could bring your own, certainly. But if you're traveling any real distance from far away, it's kind of risky and hard to bring your lamb that far. What if they stumble and got an injury along the way? Or what if the priest found a defect that you didn't think was a defect? Or what if he got sick? There was all kinds of problems of trying to haul a lamb from far away to the temple, which you could still do. But for the low, low price of whatever, uh, you could buy a pre-approved lamb at the temple, already looked over by the priests, already approved, already good to go. All you got to do is just pay for it. Convenient. So they go to buy a pre-approved lamb. But then you find out, my money isn't accepted here. The money they used for daily living out in the Roman Empire, it wasn't any good at the temple. You had to exchange it. You might have Roman or Greek or other forms of currency, but if you were coming to the temple, you had to use the temple shekel. It was the only thing that was accepted for sacrifices or even offerings, or for buying sacrificial animals. So now you pull out your cash and you got to send it through the exchange business, where they change your money from your currency to the temple shekel. And of course, they charge you a nice little convenience fee on top of it, just like Kings Island does with their hamburgers. So you go and you change your money at fee to the temple to buy the lamb at fee, which is, of course, higher price than you would find it anywhere else, to be able to finally worship God and offer your sacrifices. Convenient, yeah. Well, it appears that the temple leaders also recognized that they could charge for this convenience. And just like Kings Island does, they ramped up their pricing. Only this isn't an amusement park. This is God's temple. And it's not venture capitalists that are responsible for these extra fees. It's the religious leadership that's permitting it and benefiting from it. People are using the exclusive location of the temple, the required pilgrimages and sacrifices as a means to charge huge sums. It was the commercialization of religion, and it drew to it all kinds of corruption. People just wanted to come and worship, but they had to be financially extorted just to do it. What kind of message do you think that gives to the world? The beacon and icon of the God of heaven. You come to his temple, and if you want to worship, we're going to charge you extra fees on top of fees to even try. Yeah, Jesus got pretty upset. And now was his time to make his point, take his stand. And Jesus drove them all out. He flipped the tables. He knocked over the carts. He drove them out of the temple, and he wouldn't let anybody bring anything through anymore. He cleared that court of Gentiles and wouldn't let anyone do business. And he kept saying to them, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for the nations, but you have made it into a den of robbers." The temple and its leadership had allowed profit and corruption to fill its courts. The place that was supposed to be the place where all nations could come and commune with the one true God and get a sense of who he was, to a house of prayer, but it was filled with practices of extorting worshipers for profit. It was vile to God. God kicked him out. The purity of the temple has been filled with all kinds of impurity. The place whose main purpose is to help people in purity come worship God, connecting with God, being a place to exact profits from anyone not drawing near to God, makes your blood boil, doesn't it? Jesus cleansed the earthly temple by doing a job the leadership of the temple should have already been doing, expelling the corruption. Only the leaders, kind of like the prophets, great prosperity this was bringing to the coffers, they found a way to commercialize worship. And it was making them fabulously wealthy. They weren't interested in stopping the gravy train, so they had to stop Jesus. And we see that play out as we move forward through the week. At this moment, though, at least, they had a chance to see what Jesus was doing as the right thing. They had a chance to reflect for just a moment and see that, sure, Herod restored this building to glory in man's eyes. Jesus was actually restoring the glory of the temple in God's eyes. The temple's leaders thought that things had never been better under their leadership. How could you argue with the great giant success of this greatest temple ever built, with record number of pilgrims coming in every year and profits to show for it? How could you argue with such success? Only in the process, they lost the heart of God. And the heart of God was what the temple was there in the first place for. But Jesus came and flipped some tables. Didn't stop it altogether, though, but it made a statement. Today, there's still those who want to commercialize religion, One of the big ones, you've heard me talk about it in the times past, is the prosperity gospel. You've got to be on guard for those who want to turn true worship into impure profit. But we've got to be careful too that we don't grow too comfortable ourselves with sin and wickedness in our own lives. You know, these prophets in the temple, they didn't show up overnight. They kind of grew with time. Maybe we can charge a little more. We got to be ready to check our own heart in worship before God and not let this impurity creep come in and set in. If you're living in a sin, get rid of it now, yesterday. Get the sin out of your temple. Clean it out of your courtyards. Get it out of your heart so that as Jesus dwells in you, he doesn't want to flip the tables in there either. We often see ourselves on the side of the crowds, the victims, that we were abused by those in power. And that may be true. But I think it's also important we often consider how we might react if we were the ones in the seats of influence and leadership that Jesus is criticizing. Our choices as we lead our lives. Because that's exactly where we sit if you and I are living in an unrepentant sin. And if Jesus says, hey, something's got to change here, will you say, yes, Lord, your will be done? Or how am I going to get rid of him? There's a difference between sin that you're struggling with, that you know, that you're repentant of, that you're actively working to snuff out, and sin that's pretty well established. It's got a spot underneath that portico, Solomon's next to Solomon's portico. Business is there day in and day out. You've kind of just come to accept that's where they sit. They do business over there. It's profitable. It's not hurting anything. Temple's growing. That's a very different thing than, man, I know this is sin, and Lord, help me get rid of it. Take stock of yourself. Examine your heart. This week, as the Lord wants to dwell with you, expose your heart to him. Here's a prayer that David prayed. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. I hope that's your prayer. Let's make it ours. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, as we seek to draw near to you, help us to be aware of anything in our life, like the marketplace, that stands out as an institutionalized impurity in your place. God, help us to stand with Jesus. Help us to stand under his blood, the mercy that you have. God, help us to refuse to be complicit or comfortable with the marketplace of sin in our heart. We love you, and we ask that you would make us pure. In your Son's name I pray. Amen.